the show goes on. This is the official show on the Fish on First podcast channel presented by MPT College Consulting. I'm your host, Ely Sussman. I'm your founder of Fish on First, providing Marlins fans with complete coverage of the Miami Marlins through the first 8 games of the 2024 regular season. It has been complete shit. And that has to be a new podcast record for us for earliest in a show to be dropping a curse word. There's no other way around it. They are the only remaining winless team in Major League Baseball, and they have been losing these games in ugly fashion, self-inflicted wounds, players underperforming. I am not a person that is prone to hyperbole, who chases clickbait, and yet I've arrived at this place where I have to genuinely ask, is this the worst losing streak in Marlins history? We're going to spend this episode unpacking that, and maybe you can draw your own conclusions from it once we get to the end. But that is kind of where we are 5% into this Marlins season, having to ask these big existential questions about how much damage you can do to a franchise in the course of barely 1 week's time. From 2023, around this time, 1 year ago, Jazz Chisholm Jr., new Marlins center fielder at the time, put out a tweet saying, and I quote, "Guys, it's only game number 8. Why is everyone panicking?" You may remember this one. At the time, the Marlins were 3-5. They were coming off a kind of messy loss to the New York Mets. And as you know, that season took a couple twists and turns, but ultimately led them back to the postseason. A resounding success by any measure. That was 8 games into it. And it is reasonable to remind you how long this season is. Every single major league team is going to look bad over the course of an 8-game stretch at some point during the season. Every single one, even the Dodgers this year, even the Braves, every single team is going to have an ugly 8-game stretch. The way that these 8 games have gone, though, and not only because it's at the start of the season, but for what we've learned about this Marlins team over these 8 games is kind of the reason why it is reasonable to panic. I'm seeing a lot of panicking out there, not just nationally over teams, over writers that may have certain agendas. You see it locally. You see it from a lot of Marlins fans out there kind of shifting their understanding about where this team is headed. And I guess we could take this moment briefly to talk about off the field, the huge news that came out on Thursday about Eury Perez having to undergo Tommy John surgery, a setback from his case of elbow inflammation. The Marlins had already been without him. They were going to be without him for at least another month or so. He had been in the middle of a throwing progression. He had just thrown a bullpen earlier this week, and that is when the setback occurred. Surgery was recommended. He's going to undergo surgery on Monday, and that is part of the equation. I think what you learn from following baseball for a while is that no one individual player moves the needle quite as much as you think they should. So especially one like Perez, who is as talented as he is, unestablished at the big leagues, at a stage of his career where his workload is going to be monitored. That is just one of the data points here that makes you think that, all things considered, this kind of losing streak has dramatically changed the entire outlook of the franchise for this entire upcoming year right here. So I want to draw your attention to this playoff odds win probability chart from Fangraphs. Follow this pretty closely throughout the entire season. Entering opening day, they had the Marlins right around 29% probability of making the postseason. And as of Thursday afternoon, they were down to 7%. Their odds cut in a quarter of what they were just entering the season 8 days prior, from about 29 to 7% probability making it to the postseason by virtue of losing all of their games right here. We're going to revisit this chart in just a little bit, but talking about what it is that makes this losing streak so concerning beyond just the losses themselves. It starts with the quality of the competition they're facing. That 7 of these first 8 games were at home in Lone Depot Park. And just this most recent one on Thursday, a blown lead to the Cardinals in Busch Stadium. That was the only one on the road. The quality of the competition has not been great. It has been average at best. That's being really generous to what you may expect the Pirates to improve with a young team that may be getting better than they've been in recent years. The Angels, the Otani-less Angels, also missing just a lot of other talents. Not a particularly good team. One that I think by almost all prognostications, the Angels are expected to be a sub 500 team, and not any better than they were last year. And then the Cardinals. We're going to get to the Cardinals again a little bit more deeply in the second half of the show. A team that was 20 games under 500 last year, and that brought back a lot of the same faces as they did a year ago. That even if they were expected to improve from over what they were a year ago, it's like it is a team that is generously in the mix for a postseason berth, but not even a prohibitive favorite in their own division or to even make it back to the playoffs. None of the opponents the Marlins have faced at this point are particularly good. And a lot of the star players, with the exception of Mike Trout during the Angels series, a lot of the star players haven't really showed out in the course of these games so far. It's not like the talent from the opposition is really jumping off of the screen when you watch these games. It is more so about what the Marlins are doing to themselves. To get into some of the stats at this point in the season, through 8 games, hitting 204 with a 589 OPS. Marlins opponents are hitting 276 with an 841 OPS, a 252 point gap in OPS. Marlins being doubled up in runs by their opponents, 59-29. As you know, the theme of last year was the team outperforming their run differential. And not only has, the luck gone away, but like this is a well earned 0-8 start. I think by Pythagorean record, that's about their run differential suggests about a 2-6 record. So it's maybe a little bit unlucky, but it has been terrible against, as I mentioned, below average competition any way you slice it to this point in the season. There are just so many flaws to this team that you look at, and a lot of it is centered on pitching and defense, which were going to be crucial to the Marlins coming into this year. You knew that the offense had somewhat limited ceiling. They were hoping that they had sufficient pitching depth to be as good as they were last year. And I don't know what they were looking for defensively. Starting with the pitching, it's especially the bullpen, right? Because last year, one reason why they were winning all those close games was because you had a bullpen that in those high leverage situations saved their best for those moments. They got out of more jams than you ever thought they would. Even if the overall bullpen numbers at times looked pretty good, but even the performance kind of outdid what those surface stats said, or even what the advanced stats said. They were just a extremely clutch team. And you had to tip your hat to Skip Schumacher and his staff for putting relievers in these matchups that the vast majority of the time were working out in the Marlins' favor. Most of the coaching staff is still there. Obviously, Skip is still there. I don't think he's necessarily pressing the wrong buttons. It's more so that these relievers just are not as good as they were a year ago. A lot of it starts with Tanner Scott. Unfortunately, even in a really small sample, he's already had a game where he walked the bases loaded, and that set up a go-ahead run to score. He is not at a clean outing yet. There have been so few clean outings by anybody in this bullpen. Isaac Azut, one of my Fish on First staffers, he was pointing it out that I think many people have noticed as well is just the quality of the stuff of these Marlins pitchers are down compared to what they were last year, compared to what they were in spring training. You see it with Andrew Nardi, for example. Nardi was the most recent GOAT for the Marlins on Thursday, came with a couple inherited runners and a lead. It was the exact situation that he was so prosperous in 2023. He blew it. He was also hurt by the defense behind him. We're going to get to that in just a moment. He's not throwing as hard as he was last year. Tanner Scott, not throwing quite as hard. Anthony Bender, who's been one of the few bright spots of this bullpen so far, he's not throwing as hard as he did prior to Tommy John surgery. And fastball velocity is so crucial for relievers. Whatever reason, whatever strength and conditioning Marlins were doing It seems to have negatively impacted a lot of these guys at the same time. George Soriano, who recently had a very ugly outing during the homestand, his fastball velo was down from what we saw when he was up in the majors last year. So many of these guys, it's their stuff is down and their results and everything is down. Like some of the only bright spots in this pen have been Declan Cronin, who for reasons that are still beyond me, they felt that he was the one worth optioning, and they can't even recall him for another week and a half due to that. Brian Hoeing has been good in mop-up duty in low leverage situations, and Anthony Bender has been good so far, even though he doesn't look quite as sharp as he had been prior to his injury. And now we have to get into the defense before we get into the break, talking about why it is that this start is so concerning. I- I'm not a big told you so guy, but I think more than anybody else, I was harping on how troubling this defensive alignment looked heading into the season, how it looked in spring training. Uh, so few guys you could point to that were actually good at fielding their position. One of them being Jazz Chisholm Jr., who is still so new to center field. I'd say that he has unequivocally been fine defensively, whether you want to say he's a plus defender at this point or just average ish at center field. He's been fine so far. And who else? Who else on this entire team have been fine? Um, the issues have been jarring. Uh, just going by what the most recent events, Luis Ariz really stood out for his performance on Thursday, making a couple errors, making I think a third misplay up the middle that wasn't even charged an error. Tim Anderson, the inconsistency of his throws, the quality of his throws has stood out, as well as his range still looking really limited as it was last year. I mean, I didn't want to single too many guys out because it really has been just about everybody defensively, mostly with the exception of Jazz, that have been terrible. And it's not always shown up in terms of errors. There have been a lot of earned runs that have been entirely on the defense that put them in really bad situations. It puts immense pressure on this pitching staff to miss bats. And they have not really done it at a high enough level to get around the bad defense behind them. I should have mentioned also the starting pitching. On Thursday, all 8 of these games, the starting pitchers have not completed 6 innings. And Louis Adio Weiss, another one of my staffers, has been really fixated on this. Nobody is going deep into these games. And yet, you keep hearing from Skip that he has relievers that are down, that he needs more length, and yet he's not pushing these guys to go deep into games. And frankly, they're not looking competent in the middle innings in order to get that long enough leash to pitch deep into the games and save the bullpen. 8 straight games, no starts even reaching 6 innings. That matches the longest streak of its kind from the entire 2023 season. So you may think, well, we're in this era where you don't get long starts in the first place, especially in a Sandy Alcantara-less world. Um, Even last year, this matches already the longest drought of its kind last year. Um, Highly unusual, and it just has that domino effect where it forces you to use a lot more relievers. It has forced them to send down some relievers for fresh arms, bring up fresh arms that are non-competitive without even having to single guys out. You know who I'm talking about. Some of these fresh arms they brought up that are not conducive to winning whatsoever, that are there out of necessity. So yeah, going back to the defense, they were entering this final game of this. Well, I shouldn't say final game yet, as we'll get to. The big question is how long will this losing streak go on? Entering game 8, the Marlins were ranked second to last in baseball in defensive runs saved, only better than the Oakland A's. That completely matches the eye test here, just because across this team, it's a lack of range, just a lack of hands on in a lot of cases as well. I would say the instincts have been okay for the most part, but the execution is not there. These guys just are not good defensive players, and yet they are having to play defense. And when you have all these guys next to each other, the issues compound. It is harder to quote unquote hide a bad defender when the vast majority of your guys are bad at fielding your position. Um, yeah, all you have to do is watch these games to know exactly what I'm talking about. All the missed opportunities to turn double plays, the quality of the throws across the board have, for the most part, been really bad. The bright spots have probably been Jazz, and honestly, Avi Garcia, I would say, has been fine in his few total chances defensively as well in the corner spots. And outside of that, even the catching position, I feel has just been meh at best. I think average would even be too kind. So that is just making it all the more difficult for the Marlins to prevent runs at this point. Just a totally messy situation. They've looked every bit as bad as an 0-8 team, and that is why they're at least in consideration for this distinction of worst losing streak in Marlins history. It is not the longest one, so we're going to get into. There have been some longer ones, but the perception of this Marlins team has changed dramatically over the course of these 8 games. I think even myself and my staff, we were pretty blunt about how this team is worse than last year, that they were in all likelihood not going to win as many games, that their chances of making the playoffs were slim to begin with. We still thought they would be somewhat competent. The idea of being potentially one of the worst teams in baseball, of having to already be thinking about selling pieces off of your and stripping things down, that did not seem like a reasonable thing that would come to your mind 5% into the regular season. But these are so serious issues in terms of just the talent on the team, the way the pieces fit together, and then this big blow off the field with Yuri, where a critical reinforcement that you were not expecting to get, but cautiously optimistic could like work his way back into your rotation. He's now totally out of the mix for the rest of the season. Like it has to change the entire way that you view this team. And there just are not very many consecutive losing streaks in Marlins history that I feel have had this kind of deep, um, profound change on the way that you perceive an entire season. For in order to for this like to reach this point, this has really been remarkable. And I'm going to get into some of the comps now in just a moment. Right before that, you should know by now that our podcast is presented by MPT College Consulting. They pride themselves on helping clients navigate the college application process. This includes preparation for standardized testing, guidance through high school, assistance with essays and applications, and choosing the right college. Their work is always geared toward the specific needs of the individual client as they strive to make this process as stress-free for the family as possible. Visit them today at mptcollegeconsulting.com to learn more about their services and schedule a free consultation. Back here on the official show, trying to put this in some historical context. When I say this is one of the worst losing streaks in Marlins history, here's your reminder for those watching on YouTube. I'll be sure to embed this table in our article page as well and send it out on social media. Longest losing streaks in Marlins history. This one now tied for 8th. 8 consecutive games, tied for 8th. There have been 7 losing streaks in Marlins history, even longer than this one, just so that people watching can see the full thing. There it is. I feel as the playoff odds chart shows, the Marlins were, kind of underdogs just on the periphery of the playoff race entering this season. And now to go where it would be borderline miracle to turn it around from to go to 7% playoff odds to getting in to October would the fact that that perception has changed so much and that it has been rooted every bit in the way they've performed. This is highly unusual for things to shift this much in such a short amount of time. By process of elimination, there are 3 streaks on this list that were longer than the current one, and they were all within the same season in 1998. That year should send shivers down your spine if you're old enough to have lived through it. That was the after the very first fire sale in Marlins history, immediately following the 1997 championship, stripped everything down, in order to save some money and reset things. They ended up losing 108 games, including separate losing streaks of 11, 11, and 9. So, for example, like those are ones that I felt were not as bad a losing streak as what the Marlins are going through right now, because those were a year where they just didn't have those expectations whatsoever. So you're not going to change the way you feel about rebuilding team just because they lose a few more games and go longer between wins than you might have expected. And there are several others like here that match that description or somewhat similar. There are some recent ones that we'll get into, like in 2021 and 2022. There were post trade deadline losing streaks both of those years. The final 2 years of Don Mattingly's tenure as manager, both times where the Marlins already had made the decision to be sellers at the deadline. So, especially in 2022, that was the one where I remember their offense went into a total hibernation during that streak. They lost 9 in a row in late August, early September. Then in 2021, there was a streak in August. I remember that as well, where those were agonizing to observe. But yeah, it didn't really change much because that team was not in the playoff mix anyway. They already knew that they were like looking farther into the future for their objectives right there. In 2021, there was another streak earlier in the year, late May to early June. I looked back at that one and I was refreshed that early in that 2021 season, that was the year where the Marlins were really underperforming their run differential. And that even though they were well up below 500, they were outscoring their opponents by a comfortable margin. And that was kind of the turning point there where it went from does this team have another gear that they're going to get to that's when it turned to, well, this team actually has some fundamental issues that they're not going to be able to overcome. And the hole just got a little bit too deep right there. A lot of other ones on here. The longest streak, I already mentioned 98 had 2 11-game losing streaks. The other 11-game losing streak was in 2011. And so that is a kind of a complicated parallel here because there were 2 separate losing streaks in June of 2011. They started off that month by losing 8 in a row. Then they won a game. And then they lost 11 more in a row from June 11th to June 20th. That losing streak, those combinations of adjacent losing streaks directly costed Edwin Rodriguez his managerial job right there. That was the final year before moving into Marlins Park. The team was in very good position entering June through the first third of the season. They were they were comfortably in the wild card mix. And then by the time you got to a few weeks later, by virtue of those 2 combined losing streaks, it was just the opposite, where they were it was pretty clear that they were not going to get things back. They had a couple injuries pop up, including Josh Johnson. Josh Johnson was, when healthy at that time, a true ace and a Cy Young contender, and he got hurt in late May of that year and would miss the rest of the year. So that was one that is like kind of an honorable mention, but you have to combine those losing streaks a little bit. So when you combine those two, losing like 19 out of 20 and totally flip where you are in the standings around, I think that is, if you want to consider that like one long massive streak, then that is kind of in this similar conversation. But that team was not one that I guess you could say they had comparable expectations coming into the year, and they were in a good spot. And by the end of that streak, it was clear that a lot was going to change entering 2012. As you know, they did change a ton from not just the coaching staff, but of course the roster and the rare investments that they made into the team entering that Miami Marlins era. So that's kind of like something that worth noting that was pretty seismic. But I think the most fascinating parallel is between this year and just going back 1 year to that losing streak of the same length, 8 games coming out of the 2023 All-Star break. The Marlins were one of the feel-good stories of all of baseball by the All-Star break of last year. I think 15 games over 500 or so. They had that one-run magic. They had those star players, with Luis Ariz in particular, kind of dominating all the headlines with his chase for 400. And by playoff odds alone, that dip that they had during that 8-game losing streak was actually a bigger dip than what they're going through right now. It were right around 74% coming out of the All-Star break by Fangraphs playoff odds in 2023. And by the time the streak ended, they were hovering around 50. So the drop off this year from opening day to now has been about 22%. But last year it was about 25, 26. to go from 3/4 chance of making the playoffs to being a coin flip at that point. Now, do think still that they're going through right now, even though by total percentage drop off, it's not as severe. Um, I I think this current thing that they're going through is more distressing because at least last year you had a pretty extensive period of performance to fall back on. You had the majority of your season was already in the books, and this team had already shown that they did certain things well. And I think some of the regression was also expected at that time, right? Nobody was under the delusion that they were going to win every single one-run game the entire year. I think people were aware of the limitations that the offense had, and Sandy Alcantara was still not fully himself, and that had been an issue all year. They had other concerns about their rotation depth. It was around that time that Yuri Perez got sent down to the minors to take a breather to manage his innings, and then Johnny Cueto was about to be brought back onto the pitching staff. I remember that whole exchange very vividly. That transition to welcoming Cueto back, even though he looked like a shell of his former self. Like that team had deficiencies, and yet the timing was also convenient for the Marlins because it was still before the trade deadline, just by enough. It had went from July 14th to July 22nd. The deadline was about a week and a half after it ended, and they performed just well enough after that streak in order to still be buyers, in order to swing those trades for Josh Bell and Jake Berger and David Robertson. So they were still buyers despite that because they'd built enough of a cushion for themselves. They felt confident enough in the culture that they had set. And the timing of it was so that they could make tangible improvements to the team to try to address some of those problems that were causing those issues during the streak. Now, having this losing streak at the start of the year, you have all your options in front of you. Plenty of time in order to potentially make improvements right here. But I mean, the conditions are entirely different, starting with the front office, where you have Peter Bendix instead of Kim Eng. You have an executive in the first year of a deal instead of the one in the last guaranteed year of her deal. So the motivations are different. This is something that I feel like we've touched on sufficiently leading into the season, that like Bendix is not being evaluated as directly on wins and losses this year as Kim Eng was last year. It's not the same incentives for him to put all his chips and making this team win as many games as possible. He needs to be looking out for the long term, acting in the best long term interest of the organization. And because of that, like some of those same deals that Kim made at last year's trade deadline, those win now moves, those are not going to happen this year just because she used up a lot of the assets they had at that time. A lot of the prospect capital that they had have already been gone. And so there's very little for Bendix to use, even if he wanted to, even if he had like very clear idea of what this team needed in order to turn things around. And the other drawback of being at the start of the year is that there's just no evidence whatsoever that these pieces fit together. And now there have been some setbacks injury wise. There have been just so few cases individually where you see players and you see like tangible improvements. Like how many of these guys are actually better than the versions of themselves that we saw in 2023? There's just very little evidence that these guys have improved their skills, that they're more, that they've like, whether it's physically or whether it's strategically or tactically, like there's just, they need to really prove so much in order for you to even think about investing more in the present version of this team. And we haven't even seen that yet. So, and I think, again, just to pull up these charts one more time for the people watching on YouTube or on our site, yeah, that drop off from 29% to 7 is a lot more damaging than 74 to 50, where yeah, it's really bleak right now. It will take a pretty stunning turnaround in order to take this team as currently constructed and get them in. And you just don't see where that turnaround is going to come from, given how thin this organization is at the upper levels of the minors in terms of guys that you actually think could be upgrades over who they currently have. I don't think, all due respect, I don't think Will Banfield is going to save their season. I don't think Tristan Gray is going to save their season. When they get Braxton Garrett and Edward Cabrera back from injury, which could happen in the coming weeks, those guys kind of have some of the same issues are still going to be prevalent in terms of, can starters go deep enough into their games? Can these relievers that have diminished stuff somehow get their stuff back? And how in the world are you going to turn deficient defenders all over the diamonds into better defenders? Like, um, there's only so much you can teach veteran players, and if it hasn't really been taught entering the year, um, like it's hard to totally flip a switch and turn things around. Just looking back again at these other longest losing streaks for the Marlins, there was one early in 2014 in April that year. In May of 2015, that was the one that cost Mike Redmond his job and led to the Dan Jennings experiment. Back then, there was one in the second half of 2007 when they were already out of the race. There were a bunch in the early 2000s where, those teams were not quite, it wasn't really reasonable to see them as postseason teams, partly because that was also the era where there was only one wild card. So, I, in conclusion, I think that this is right. I think this might be the longest consecutive losing streak of games that the Marlins have ever had when you take everything in combination with each other, because of the timing of it at the very start of the year, because of all the different fires that have popped out, and how overwhelming it seems that you could actually put out all these fires at the same time potentially. And even though you're in this era where there's three wild cards, I think that's kind of the only reason why they entered this season even feeling they have a shot, and why Bruce Sherman could even say with a straight face that they felt like this was a good product, or a competitive product that was worth showing up for this year, is because the bar to make the postseason is lower than it's historically has been. It's been in the mid 80s. If you get mid 80s wins, you can get in. And over the course of a single season, maybe they do get fortunate again. Maybe some of the reasons why they were able to prevail in high leverage situations last year could carry over. Like, it wasn't totally outlandish, even though I disagreed with it. It was not an outlandish opinion to think that this team could be competitive all season long. When you just did an honest analysis, that seems to be within the range of outcomes. And now all of a sudden, just within the span of barely a week, that it doesn't really seem like that's within the range of outcomes for them anymore with all the events that have happened to this point. It starts with ownership, the fact that Bruce did not spend more money on this team than he did last year. They just moved around the money in this case to address different areas, but it went all the way up to opening day where it looked like, hey, maybe the investment is up a little bit, and then nope, trading John Birdie to save $3 million. It gets them back where they are. This the financial restraints really prevented the Marlins from putting together a good team this year. So it seems, even if they won't directly say so. This really falls on almost everybody, though. This is a humiliating start of the season that almost everybody is culpable for it, because some of the decisions that have made, even the marginal roster moves that have perplexed me a little bit from Peter Bendix, and also the player performances. These players are not performing well. They're not performing as well as they should be. Defensively, I feel like there's potential to be not quite the worst defensive team in the league, and even offensively as well. We haven't really gotten into it, but like, entering play on Thursday, just about everybody was below average in terms of OPS. Everybody on the entire roster was a below average hitter at the same time, and there's more talent there than that. From Yeah, I don't even need to call people out individually. Like, it is just clear that the quality of at bats that they've had, the preponderance of double plays, just as we saw last year. Yeah, I could go on and on, but this team is just a total shit show. I started this pod with a curse word and got to end it with one, because um, yeah, this is bitterly disappointing for anybody that is following along. And we'll see how the players respond. Their very first off day of the season, and they have a whole lot to figure out. And just that I feel like the way that this has been put together, there's just not a whole lot they can do at this point in order to fully turn things around. That this team was not put in a great position, and then just the perfect storm of like frustration and a little bit of bad luck but just a lot of underperformance right here. It's going to be very difficult to dig out of this hole, and I think this one losing streak this early in the year, I cannot blame people for saying that they might be out on this team, that they might want to check out, that and give up on this particular season. And even beyond that, the idea that this losing streak, this one sequence of 8 days could be the impetus for an actual complete rebuild and the selling of several core pieces right now in order to, actually totally reset this in a way that could affect the team beyond even 2025 or 2026. And I can see it. Um, and it's not totally shocking big picture. I think the question was people were wondering whether the Marlins would actually just detonate things this offseason and not even wait for the first season in order to really blow it up and build it up again in Peter Bendix's image. And instead, maybe they just wait a few extra months for the team to fail on the field before doing that. But yeah, it's really depressing that this could happen just because of fans. I thought had really reasonable expectations that this team would just be competent this year, that would put forth, some kind of effort in order to keep the momentum going from 2023, that they showed up in bigger numbers and supported this team in bigger numbers than they had historically, and that ownership would actually value that. And it ultimately starts at that highest level with ownership right here, putting them even in the position where it was possible to have a losing streak like this straight out of the gate, to be so um, just clumsily put together with this team that there was even any sort of sequence of events that could lead to this deep hole that they've dug themselves into as the last remaining winless team in Major League Baseball. Um, but this has been a unplanned official show episode. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. I usually do one of these every week, typically early in the week, and I think I will be doing one coming out next Tuesday morning. So please tune into that wherever you get your podcasts. Rate and review, leave a like as well if you're watching on YouTube, and check out our sponsors at MPT College Consulting, mptcollegeconsulting.com, presenting all of our audio programming all season long. That is the interesting spot that we find ourselves in, because we're going to continue to provide complete Miami Marlins coverage, even if it is goes in the direction that this team is going into, where the current season doesn't have a whole lot of stakes attached. We find all the angles. We look at all the angles of this organization and find meaning, insights, and entertainment from it. And we appreciate everybody that supports our work. Wouldn't be an episode of the pod without me plugging our super subs, fishonfirst.com/subscriptions, as little as $4 a month, to support the extensive coverage that we provide to you guys, all levels of the organization, all angles of it, and special perks for our super subs who make that extra commitment to keeping us going and keeping us growing, regardless of the wins or losses at the major league level. We hope you consider signing up if you aren't already a super sub for Fish on First. This has been the official show, so I'll be back again soon. Whole lot of coverage between now and then on fishonfirst.com, our social accounts, and right here on this podcast channel, our various shows. So wherever you get your Marlins coverage, we hope you get it from us and learn a little and laugh a little with us as we go through the remaining 95% of this Marlins season. It's going to be an interesting ride and a surprising first chapter, but they're going to win games eventually. And so I'm looking forward to talking about a better mix of wins and losses as the season goes on. Thanks again for tuning in. I've been Ely Sussman. Go Fish.